PGXPub the honor of giving the first talk, which was about PGSQL. And yeah, that was really awesome. It was a really good talk. He gives a great talk. So he's the CTO of Values of N, and they have a few different products. Stick It is a great one. It's a little sticky note to-do list kind of thing. It's really cute and awesome. And I Want Sandy. It's an email assistant program. And he also, for a long time, worked on supported, offering consulting services for Bricolage, Perl content management system. So, but now he works a lot on Ruby. So, take it away.
Thank you, Selena. So, just to kind of recap, what did you miss here? Oh, yeah, that. It's a decision that predated my presence. When we decided to start on Sandy, I worked with Rails, I said, so do you want to switch to PostgreSQL? So yes, this one runs on PostgreSQL. We're planning to go general availability on this on Monday. So that's what I want Sandy on. I also was one of the original developers on it, and I'm currently the maintainer of the Bricolage open source content management system in Perl running on Postgres. I'm a Perl hacker. I've been hacking Perl since 25, and now I'm a Ruby hacker. I've been hacking Ruby since 2006. I've done a little PGSQL hacking. I did that in 2006 to 2006. Wrote a couple articles for the O'Reilly folks about that, and I'm also Anna's dad. So anyway, I have some assumptions about you guys. I'm assuming most of you are new to Rails, or at least you have an interest in Rails, that you're familiar with PostgreSQL. And what you would need to know if you're interested in Rails is what's specific to Postgres. So how many of you folks here have done some Rails programming? Oh, quite a few. And so how many Perl guys we got here? And PHP? And Ruby? This is just the same Rails folks, yeah. Okay, so we got a pretty good representation here. Yeah?
Groovy. Groovy.
Groovy. Oh, Groovy. Yes, Python. I'm sorry.
No,
yes,
no. Groovy is a Ruby-like language for the JVM.
Oh, okay.
And there's a framework also called Rails, which is very similar to Rails.
Yeah, I would have taken a different name. Trying to ride that train, huh? Or more specifically, I'm assuming I'm trying to give you some Rails essentials for Postgres enthusiasts. Those of you who've done Rails programming can correct me where I'm mistaken. So let's do the basics for those of you who aren't familiar. Ruby is a pure object-oriented language, open source programming language. I think it's under the MIT license. Its design goals were basically to have the elegance of small talk, the pragmatism of Perl, and the ease of use of Python, particularly in terms of teaching. I borrowed those analogies from an article, so don't rat me out. What Mats has said is that I wanted a scripting language that was more powerful than Perl, more object-oriented than Python, and that's why I decided to write my own language. It's Ruby. Ruby on Rails is an open source web application framework that uses an MVC architecture, as they all do these days. It claims database independence, web server independence, and has RESTian Ruby dispatch method for its control, and offers, of course, Ruby 10. So, David Hannemeyer Hansen has said, Rails is opinionated software that eschews placing the old ideals of software in a primary position. One of those ideals is flexibility. Basically, he says, one of the reasons that I think Rails works is because flexibility is one of those old ideals that we eschew. It has a particular kind of philosophy of how applications can be built, and it sticks to that, and that's why he thinks it's successful. Or in other words, another way that he has put it is, so that's a bit about the Rails philosophy. So, let's talk a bit about a brief overview of the Rails MVC model. Active record is the model. Action view is the view. responsible for views, and action controller is responsible for the controllers. So active record is an object relational mapper, a database independent again. It defines the models by looking at the schema in the database. So it loads a schema from the database to define what attributes you have on a particular object, on a particular model. It offers metaprogramming constraints and callbacks and a number of other things. And it offers a number of different kinds of relationships, including many to many, or has many, belongs to, and hasn't belongs to many, and a few others. And I'll do a brief overview of those later. So here's a quick example of what an active record class might look like. First, how you define classes in Ruby is you just declare the class and you have it in an end block, so class and end. The little angle bracket there is how you do inheritance, so all the models inherit from the base class for active record. Then you can put in some constraints. And this is kind of the example of the metaprogramming available in Ruby. So here we're saying that the login attribute is required, and that the password attribute is required if the method called password required question mark, because you can have question marks at the end of Ruby method names, returns true. So that actually then is a reference to a method that you then define in the class. Similarly, you can have callbacks, and there are like 6 or 8 levels of callback you can have relative to saves, all inside transactions, unfortunately. But then you can, within your callbacks, have it call back to other methods you define in your class. For example, I often have a method to set default values before it inserts it in the database, and I get, value is not null errors. And here's an example of how you can define a relationship. We can say that a user has many widget objects. And this is a pretty simple way of doing things. Action view, it uses Ruby ERB templating, and it shares instance variables from the controller methods that dispatch to it, which I'll show you in a bit. It's somewhat analogous to HTML, Mason, or PHP, or JSP, or any one of these other templating architectures you're familiar with. Here's an example. This looks a lot busier than it actually is, but that's true of all these templating architectures, I think. First of all, Rails is all about the sugar. Sugar, sugar, sugar. This is a very sweet tasting framework. Here it provides a form for method, and basically you're saying it's a form for a model user, and then you pass a user object. And then Ruby, you can program things in blocks, and blocks are defined by do and then end. You can also use angle braces if you're happy as a programmer. You pass parameters to your block, and then that's defined as the value from within the block. So I'm saying this is a form object. Here I'm using the DOM-ID method, which is a convenience method that you pass a model object to, and it generates an ID that you can use as the ID attribute of your form elements. So then, of course, this is the text substitution tag in ERB that I just put the ID in there. So this is a form for the email field and label for the email field. And then here's another convenience method. There are a whole bunch of convenience methods in Rails for generating HTML tags. This one generates a field tag, so I'm giving it the name, user, bracket, email, the value, and the ID for it, so the label matches right up to it. And then I'm just doing the same thing here for password, putting underscore pass there, and using the password field tag, convenience method, and passing names. These funny names, by the way, are designed like this because Ruby actually parses these out in the callback methods to create hashes within hashes in your parameters in the callback, so you can assign them right into objects if you like in a single method call. But speaking of that, action controllers uses Ruby method dispatch via routes, meaning that you can create a routing table so that a particular URL resolves to a particular method in a particular controller class. Instance variables defined within the controllers are shared with the views. So the user variable with the @ in that previous slide is defined by a controller. So the templates appear to run as within the controller class. With the action control, you control dispatch of what gets rendered, redirection, and web server stuff, returning errors, and that sort of thing. The sort of stuff you usually expect. Here's a quick example. Let's say you want to edit a particular user. So I'm in the user controller here. Again, I'm using inheriting from action controller base, as we did with the model, inheriting from the model. And I'm defining an index method. The index method is, I believe, defaults to your slash, just like index.html on an Apache server, default.html on a Microsoft server. But you can also create routes. In the routing table, I might have a parameter ID here, and that means that an ID has to be passed as part of the URL. And that gets put into the ID attribute of the parameters, which you can see here. So I'm using the user class to find this particular user object. After that, unless there's been a post, I just return. And that means that whatever template is assigned to this method goes ahead and renders the view of the edit form. But if there is a post, I'm assuming the user has filled in the form and posted the data. So we go ahead, and this is where the email address and the password would be within the user hash, within the parameters hash, right within the controller. Which is kind of a nice way to go ahead and update all your attributes on an object at once. And then once that's done, we can redirect to another controller, another action, another controller, another action to this controller, what have you. You use the name of the controller, so that this would be home controller, like this is user controller, and then it has an index method like this. So you reference the controller names and their methods within your redirects, and it does the right thing and generates all the URLs. By the way, interrupt me with questions or comments or insults at any time. So let's get to some of the essentials for you guys, since I assume most of you are really interested in Postgres, and that's why you're here. So let's talk about Rails migrations. Rails migrations are how you programmatically make changes to your database schema. And I don't mean schema in the Postgres sense, but in the terms of your table layout for an application. Common tasks for migration are provided in inherited methods, such as create a table, create an index, add a column, remove a column, remove an index, etc., etc. There are a whole bunch of these. Drop table. So here's a quick example. Again, we're using inheritance to inherit from active record migration, which is how we get all these convenience methods. All the migrations go in numbered files within a particular directory, and where you're working with Rails. They're named with a number, and so they're run in numbered order. You can have up to 999 of them. We're up to 200 now, and Sandy. Hope we don't get too far ahead of ourselves.
Right. Time for a Rails patch.
Yeah, they don't pay attention to my Rails patches. And I'm not there yet. Within a migration, you always define two methods. You define self.up, which is a class method. When you're defining methods in Ruby, for a class method, you just use self.up. For an instance method, it would just be up. And we also define down. So this allows you to migrate up and down for the database. In this example, I'm calling the create tables method, The name of the table is users. I don't remember what force true equals. And then I'm passing a block to it in which the table object is passed. Within the block then, I can call the column method on the table object to find the names of the columns I want, their data types, and a few other things like whether they're null or not, which is almost always false for me, and some default values, if you like. And then next, I go ahead and create an index on this. And if you want me to create an index on multiple columns within the table in Ruby, you can pass an array of the columns that you're indexing, and there are optional parameters you can pass in here. I'm saying it's a unique index. In the down method, I go ahead and just reverse that. First, I remove the index, and then I drop the table. Right? So this is a simple way to allow you to go up and down and do your migrations as appropriate to maintain and develop your app. Now, there are a few caveats about Rails migrations. There is no support built in for foreign key constraints. There is no support for check constraints built in. There is no support for functional defaults, like now or current timestamp. There's no support for partial indexes, in other words, a where clause in your index. There's no support for views or rules or triggers. There's no, it's really much at all. This is as a result of the Rails philosophy being very much about the database just being, you know, a giant data store where you store your crap. In other words, they developed on MySQL. So there are a number of ways to work around this. The primary way is a method that's available to you in migration called execute. Execute allows you, of course, to execute whatever SQL statements that you want. So you write your own SQL, and you can get access to all the PostgreSQL goodies that you need. This is not, of course, necessarily database independent. One of the big things about Rails migrations is that it's independent, so that if you're developing on MySQL, you can deploy to Postgres or vice versa. But if you use anything other than simple tables and indexes, you know, I think that's it. You're SOL for database independence with migrations. However, if you don't really care about that, and I don't since I mainly just use Postgres, is you can go ahead and use the execute method, and if you're using compliant SQL that all your databases will understand, then of course it'll work, but otherwise you don't. Here's an example that of course is Postgres specific. I'm defining an up method in this migration in which I'm just calling execute, and I'm saying set the updated at and created at defaults to current timestamp. So this is the way you have to do functional defaults in Postgres in Rails if you want. And I have a lot of migrations that look like this. Yeah.
I assume you could like do if Postgres execute this SQL or something else.
Yeah, but who wants to do that?
Sometimes you have to.
Well, yeah, I would say if, and I have a lot of ifs like that in my things because I do things differently in development than in production, for example. But yeah, you could say if the driver is Postgres to do this, otherwise do nothing, I guess. That's what you have to do for some of the others.
Right. Couldn't you extend active record migrations to actually
Yes.
accept a few of these things?
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a little bit in a minute. Here's another example. Here I want to create a partial index on the database. So here I'm just calling execute and creating my unique index. And I'm passing where clause that I want. And then of course in my down, I've got the index. I actually named this index the same way that Rails itself names indexes, so I could have actually used its own, remove index method. Why some methods are called add and some are create and some are drop and some are remove, I don't know in the migrations.
And would I be correct in assuming that Rails doesn't out of the box support multi-column indexes either?
Yeah, it does.
It does, okay.
My previous example, you pass an array of columns.
Got it.
Yeah. Yeah, MySQL has that.
Okay.
So what about foreign key constraints? We could use execute. All of you would probably be familiar with this sort of thing. But this, of course, is not compliant for across. Not all the databases are the same or equal. This won't work for all databases. But there's an alternative. You can use a Rails plugin. Now, Rails plugins are a method for adding third-party functionality to Rails applications. This is a thing that's built into Rails. You just take a plugin, which is just a class you define, you stick it in a directory, Rails automatically reads it in and does its stuff. And it loads, I believe it loads the plugins after it loads itself, so you can kind of screw with Rails itself. So you can use a plugin to transparently add migration methods that look just like the other migration methods, like this one. This is the one we've been using because it's the one I found when I started this 6 or 8 months ago. It's a perfectly fine one. If you go there, click the patches link to get my patch, which adds support for on-delete, update stuff. So you can have cascades and whatnot. So this, which was the original example I had for creating foreign key constraints using the execute method, becomes this. So to follow up with Josh's question, You want to use execute for your check constraints, for your partial indexes, for your triggers, your rules, your views, whatever else. But there may be other plugins available. And I haven't really looked at plugins for migrations in a while, but when I was doing research for this, I found another one for foreign key constraints that looked like it might be more complete. And I'm sure there are others for adding where clauses to the add index method and all that.
Actually, the Pennebar folks did one for stored procedure calls.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, it is relatively easy to add the plugins if they're available, or to write them yourself. I mean, they're pretty straightforward, simple Ruby code. We were just in a hurry, and I knew I wasn't going to be going back to MySQL. Speaking of views, you can, with Rails, use views instead of tables for your models. And then you can, of course, hide irrelevant tables or define permissions as appropriate. You need to always use the pluralized class name for the table name in order for Rails to recognize it. And you can add your rules for how you interact with the table, so that when you do your inserts, updates, and views, inserts, updates, deletes against the view, it can transparently do it to tables, and Rails just thinks it's a table that it's interacting with, right? Really straightforward. So here's a quick example. Let's say that you want to automatically encrypt passwords stored in the user table. So you create a view. First, I'm renaming the users table to _users just to hide it. You, of course, can assign permissions as appropriate to really hide it. And then I create a view that basically selects all the same columns from the users table, and I name it users. This is so that Rails sees this table and just does the right thing with it. Then you can create your rules to do your inserts, updates, deletes against. Here I'm doing an insert on users. Instead, I'm inserting in users all the usual stuff, but here I'm encrypting the password as an MD5 hash. Right? Real simple example, but you get the general idea. You add your other update and delete views as appropriate, and instantly you have a setup that Rails can just understand. Because as far as it's concerned, it's just the users table, and that's the way it works. But what if you want to have alternate views of your data? You have the same data, but you want to look at it differently. I'm getting ahead of myself. So here, what we have to do is create the view, and then you use the from parameter to the find method of your class, of your model. So here's an example where I'll create a view, and it gives a slightly different view of the same data. This one, this view I'm calling updated users, and basically just as a where clause where the updated at is different from created at, meaning obviously it's been updated since it was created. So this is just a different view of the same user's data. You use the find method, which is the default, de facto query method for Rails models. And you pass it the from parameter. So you note I'm calling user.find, and first is I want the very first row found returned as a single variable. And I'm saying from active users and then users. You've got to have the alias there because Rails only understands it's looking at the users table, no matter what table you're actually looking at. So you've got to say, oh yes, really, this is the users table, and it should do the right thing. That's all there is to it, to look at a different view of the same data within Rails. Incidentally, while we're here, this is how you use, this actually shouldn't be where, it should be conditions. Anyway, this is how you can specify a where clause in your queries to Rails, or one of a few ways. Here I want to do a case-sensitive query for an email address in the user object. So I say where lower emails like lower this, and then I pass in the value. So you specify an array where the first part is the actual where clause that's going to be just stuck into the query, and you can use placeholders, and then you pass in the values for your placeholders. I think you can actually pass in an array of values, and it will actually do where lower in, which is kind of a nice little trick. So, better yet, you can create a custom query method. So you basically can memoize a particular view right in a method within your user class. So you use the with scope method to memoize the arguments to the method you're defining. So for example, I'm going to here's my user class, again inheriting from the model base class. And in here I'm defining a class method called find active users. So I have find, which queries the users table. Well, maybe I just want to query the active users. So I define find active users, and I can call this method to automatically use the other view. How that's done is that we call the with scope method within the method, and we say that within the scope, the find method defaults to having its from value set to this value here. Now I'm missing a brace there. And then with scope executes, it sets up the scope, and then it executes this block. Because the block is passed to the method can do its things, and then redispatch to the block and return the values. Excuse me. So now, with this approach, you pass usual find arguments to it, just like you were calling the find method, but you don't need the from parameter. And this is actually a really cool way to set up lots of different ways of looking at your data by defining methods in your model classes, using with scope to define the default values for a bunch of these things, so that the consumers of your model class, which is to say usually your controllers, can have easy access to just calling a simple method. Any questions about this stuff? I like the crickets. So fact models, yeah.
So when using views as an abstract thing, that would cause some problems for migrations also, right? If you had like create index statements in the migrations, you need to make that an execute and use SQL for that case in order to create an index on the underlying table. Would that be true?
Well, with a migration, you name the table that you're creating an index on. So if I have a view and then I have the underscore users table, when I call the create index method, the migrations are basically ignorant of the models. You can actually use the models and all their methods within the migrations, although I don't recommend it because then your migrations start to be no longer backward. You can't go up and down. But then I can just say add index underscore users and you put it on the right table.
There's another way to deal with the limitations of migrations, and that's not using migrations.
Yes, well, I considered that when we were trying to use Sloaney.
Yeah.
Rails migrations, by the way, are run by Rails itself. It passes them through its own database interface and just executes them through that. With the permissions you've assigned to the user, that it connects to the database. So if you have a user with limited permissions, it's Rails, you're going to have to do stuff manually as Postgres or super user anyway. But the downside of this stuff, of course, is that it doesn't output a SQL script, so you can't output a SQL script and send it off to Sloaney to actually run with its schema update things and stuff. So we ended up dumping Sloaney and are using a warm failover now, which is fine. There's a minute of lag, but yeah.
From what I understand, if you use executions or execute in the migrations, when you then prepare your test database, it actually doesn't run those Postgres-specific features they're using, so you end up having a test database without foreign keys and stuff like that. Have you guys found a way around that?
No, it all works the same no matter what database you're connected to, as far as in my experience. The test database is basically just a clone of the development database.
So I believe it's actually cloning it based on a schema RD file.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. There are two different ways that Rails can do cloning. One is that it takes its own stuff, it has like a YAML file, and just replicates it. You can tell it to do migration, to do cloning just using SQL, and it'll actually use pgdump to dump the database and load it up as a test database. You have to go that way. Yeah, I forgot all that. Yeah, Josh.
Have you figured out any way to get Rails to work with a differentiated security model? That is where there are different objects use different database users?
No.
Okay.
It's
not just me.
Right. Well, I haven't had to deal with that problem. I mean, like I said, right now, like we have some very large data sets that we have to load up using copy, which you have to have a file on the database server or on a server to run it. And hey, you have to be the super user to do it, right? So for our development environment, that runs fine because we're all just using the super user on our laptops. when we do deploy, I actually have to copy that data over and run it manually myself using PSQL, and then run the migrations, which say if production, don't run this copy.
Yeah.
Right.
So but I mean, actually, one of the things I was thinking about is a case where you have a large framework that actually contains sort of multiple applications. And some of the applications are supposed to have different users, or if somebody's logged in as administrator, you actually want them to do different database permissions.
Yeah. No,
And I couldn't figure out any way to handle that with...
I don't know any web app developers who actually do that. Yeah.
Actually, there is a way to do that, if you're willing to accept a little bit of pain. So I stumbled across this while trying to get it to connect to different database servers for different models. And you can sort of force it to use a different active record connection for a certain set of, before you do whatever you're going to do with under different users, you just kick it into a different active record connection with a different...
I'm not going to show a specific example of that, but some of the other stuff I have further down we have done.
Yeah.
Kind of gets to how you do that kind of ugly magic.
Yeah, it's ugly, and it might be performance, but you need it done.
Yeah.
Does the migration try to run inside one transaction, or can you sort of...
You can
find
call the
yourself
transaction method within the migration, and then pass it everything it does as a block, and then it does the right thing, which I sometimes remember to do. When I did the big large migrations, each individual file runs within a transaction. And if you need to create a table and do some stuff with it, you have to put it in a different migration. But in Rails, or something like that, there's a couple of things in Postgres that are not transactional in schema stuff.
What other than create database?
I ran into something recently. I thought it was create table.
There's sometimes when it becomes very inefficient
Yeah.
to do these enormous operations, and
Yeah.
it will actually work.
Yeah. Anyway,
Is there any way to make that the default?
no. Patches will. So where was I? Oh, so you create your custom query methods, you keep the SQL in the model for nicer encapsulation, reuse and recycle, and with scoping it's easy. So if you're doing stuff like this, you want to use it a lot. And usually it's a sign where you're in your controllers and you're writing these really long calls to define method. That's usually an indication that you can encapsulate it within a method within your model class, so it's just there. And I do this all the time because I'll write a big thing in my controller and I'll find there's some other controller I need exactly the same thing. So I'll just define a method in the model and then go call it for finding your data. So it's a really nice way to do scoping and defining custom methods for different views of the data. So associations. These are the primary fat model interface. They provide relations via inherited methods, not unlike the migrations do. You have belongs to, you have has one, you have as many, you have has and belongs to many. So here's a quick example. Here I've defined a widget class, and I can say that widgets belong to user. This assumes that the widgets table has a user ID, underscore ID column. You can have that column be named other things, your foreign key, and then you can pass a parameter to belong to tell what the column name is. Here's an example of has and belongs to many. Here I'm saying that widgets have and belong to many gadgets, where the class name that this collection will return is gadget. The join table is the gadgets widgets table. You can leave out the class name table if the name of the join table is the pluralized form of both classes in alphabetical order. That's an example of its what is it?
Convention over configuration.
Yes, convention over configuration. It's not a convention I particularly relate to, but some of them I do. And then you can specify an order attribute so that when you call this method, you would be calling a gadgets method on a widget object and will return a collection, basically an array of gadgets in this order. Note, the thing that I learned the hard way many times when I created these join tables is you don't want an ID column on your join tables for has and belongs to many, because it'll think it's a model and it'll get confused about the sequences.
So what does that table look like there?
It's just two columns, gadget ID and widget ID.
Oh, okay.
Reciprocally, if that's a word, the gadgets class has and belong to many widgets where it just does the same thing in reverse. So this thing has and belongs to many. You define the same method in both classes to point back to each other. If you want data associated with a particular relationship between one widget and one gadget, you actually have to define another class to do that, and do a has many through. So you actually have two objects for each object in your collection.
Is there an abbreviation for has and belongs to many?
Has many through is what they recommend now.
Yeah.
Here's another one. Here in the user class, I can say has many widgets. This is the reciprocal of the widgets belongs to user, so I can say user has many widgets. This returns a collection of widgets. If you don't find an order, it returns in the order given to you by the database, which of course is undefined in Postgres. Here's a has many. You can say has many active widgets, where I have a condition where widgets active equals true. So this is a way to use the collection methods, in this case has many, to create different views of the same data, just by this kind of meta-programming that Rails likes for the model. You guys follow all this stuff?
So if you called the widgets for a given user, and the user had widgets where active was false, they just wouldn't show up in Rails?
They wouldn't show up when you called this method. If you had user.activeWidgets, they wouldn't be in there, but if you called user.widgets, they would.
Okay.
So it's two different views of the same kind of data. It's like storing two queries, basically, in methods. So this is a way, a convenience collection. So here's an example. I can find a user, and I can build a new widget where its name is text area, and it'll put it in there, and then I save the user object, and it saves the new object in there. Then I can go call the widgets method, which is defined here, and it gives me a collection, an array, basically, of widgets. And I can call each method to iterate over each one of them when I pass this block to iterate over each widget of the collection. But if I only want to know about active widgets, I call the active widgets method, and then I pass a block to it, to each one there, to get that. So this is, again, two different ways to look at the same data. You notice here, I passed a true value to active widgets. This is because if I have used active widgets on this user object somewhere else, and then I build a widgets object here, active widgets doesn't know that it has been built. So you have to tell it, you pass true here to tell it to requery the database, because the first time you call it, it'll cache its results. Here you tell it to requery the database so that the new one will be added. So, what was I doing here? I don't even remember. If you want to, the primary way to, oh, I know what it was. I knew I was going to do this. You can also pass you can call the find method on your collection object. And basically what it does is it actually just dispatches the widget find with scope where the user ID is for this particular user. It should be underscore, lowercase user. So this, basically, you define your collection as widgets, but you can say, within that collection, execute this further find. So it inherits the conditions and limitations of the original collection and passes them on to here. So this is going to be, I say where conditions lower widget's name is like foo, but internally it says, and user ID equals the ID of this user object. Right? And it'll return me another collection. This can be used to dispatch to any class method on the widget class, transparently, which is pretty nice. And it works really well except when it doesn't. What that means is that what I found just in the last week where I was trying to debug a particularly thorny problem is sometimes the scoped conditions within your collection declaration are thrown out. And I couldn't figure out why. But then another thing that Rails often does is that when you pass a query like this, oops, back. When you pass it a query like this, it'll execute one query in which it says select ID from all these conditions, and it'll execute exactly the same query again with all the conditions, and it'll add an ID in. I don't know why.
How efficient?
Oh, not. I mean, I'm tailing the log, I'm like, what the hell is that? But it does that a lot.
There's ways to make its associations a lot more efficient, though.
I'm sure there are. Okay, so let's talk for a minute about time zones. There are two magic date time columns or attributes you can add to Rails objects. They're updated at and created at, and Rails will automatically set these for active record. You don't know what they're going to be set to, what time zones, so you can make them all UTC by in your environment.rb, which is in a configuration file. You can say, hey, make them all UTC. And it's pretty good practice in general web application programming, in particular, to store all your dates and times in UTC. But there are other date time attributes that you can put on an object. Yeah.
Will that have the time zone included in the date if you don't set it to UTC? In other
No.
words, okay.
Well, it depends on what. Well, first of all, it depends on what column you use in the database. So if you use, I wonder if you use a timestamp or time zone. I don't know if Rails will save the time zone in there, but I know that Postgres throws out the time zone anyway. So what difference does it make? Postgres, from the way I understand it, timestamp with time zone is not a timestamp with a time zone. It's a timestamp where we automatically convert it to UTC and store it like that. Is that right?
Yeah, but the thing is, if you're passing in, 9 a.m. October 20th,
Yeah.
At PDT,
Yeah.
then it's going to get converted to a different UTC time than if you tell it 9 a.m. October 20th UTC.
Right.
Follow me?
Yeah, it does automatically.
Whatever it is.
It does automatically convert to UTC as a canonical time, which most of us have been used to doing in the application space anyway.
Yeah.
So I guess what I was asking is if you set the time zone on the Ruby side to something different than the Postgres server is set to, will it include the time zone information on the Ruby side so that it, okay.
Yeah.
I don't believe so.
If it's your default time zone in Postgres and you just pass no time zone at all, it'll default to the time zone you've set for the Postgres server.
Yeah.
The problem is when Ruby and the server think that the default time zone is something different. You get erratic values, or when you move the server from one hosting center to another.
Well, time zone support in Ruby is pretty remedial at this point. I actually wrote a complete subclass of time, the time class, to specifically support much better time zone support for, I want Sandy and Stick. So anyway, when you create a date time column, you're using create table within your migrations, it just creates a timestamp column. It doesn't create a timestamp with time zone. So I don't think, I mean, you can use execute to create that yourself, but I don't think Rails will send a time zone off to the database. Because MySQL doesn't do that. Other datetime attributes you might associate with your objects are not automatically converted, even though you said, hey, this is the default time zone. So can you do it manually? So each time before you save, you can have a callback in your class where you can go through all the timestamps and make sure they're converted to UTC, but I'm much too lazy for that. So what do? Okay, here's a philosophical aside about Ruby. Ruby classes are never final. You can always reopen a Ruby class and add new methods to it. Put in whatever stuff you need. The author of the original class will never know. So do it only when appropriate. Rails actually inserts a shitload of its own methods into core classes, so it can be overused. Yeah?
Oh, just the daylight savings time drift, because I assume that's going to move again, right?
You need to make sure all your time zone database in your operating system is up to date, and you have a recent version of Postgres with the update zip database. If you use Mac OS 10, you know that it wasn't updated for the recent shift for New Zealand time. So all our New Zealand customers were like, "Hey, everything's an hour off" for about 2 weeks. So here's a quick example of how you can reopen a method. Numeric is a core class in Ruby. It's all those integers and all that stuff. It's a base class for all numbers. You just say class numeric. You've reopened the class. You can then define a method in there. And here I'm defining a method called hours, in which I multiply the numeric object by 3600 to get the number of seconds per hour. So this means that I can then call, puts 2 hours and will return 7200. And for those of you who haven't seen it before, yes, you can call methods on any object in Ruby. Rails actually defines a shitload of these kinds of methods that it sticks in the numeric and a bunch of other classes. For method stuffing, you do want to use it sparingly. You should try other approaches first. You switch for a clear win in terms of encapsulation, elegance, and monkey patching. I know you were going to ask that. Monkey patching. Monkey patching is, according to Wikipedia, is a way to expand, or modify runtime code without altering the original source code for dynamic languages like JavaScript, Ruby, or Python. This is a basic feature of Ruby, and it's part of the Ruby philosophy that allows you to say, hey, just reopen classes and put your methods in as appropriate. I think this is something I got from Smalltalk. But I like to add this corollary. It's a way to clean up other people's messes without waiting for them to release new versions of your patches.
So is this like Ruby's altered go-to?
Yeah, only with dispatch.
It's really a way to make your code totally unmaintainable too.
There's a huge philosophical debate. I'm actually participating in a huge debate about this on one of the JSON lists because a lot of people do this in JavaScript now. And as Perl programmers are like, so here's a case in point, right? Say we want to store all of our date times as UTC. Rails doesn't do it, so we do it ourselves. First, you get out your trowel and you dive into the archaeology of the Rails code to find out where the heck it gets things ready for the database. Then, once you figure that out, you go ahead and you change it. So in this case, I am reopening the PostgreSQL adapter class in Rails. And if you need to do this for other database drivers, you might need to do the same thing elsewhere. I am aliasing the original quoteDate method to a new method name I call quoteDate. An alias is a nice method available in Rails to allow you to basically take and give a method another name. Then I go ahead and I redefine the quoteDate method that I took the alias to here to do the right thing. In this case, the value passed to it, I'm converted to UTC if that's what's been asked for. And then I go ahead and I redispatch to the aliased original version. Bingo. I've got instant UTC only storage without having to create all my callback set defaults kind of methods. So did you notice that method was called quoted? Is the quoted date. And so if you use placeholders in your code, and you use placeholders, right? Active record quotes values itself. Active record doesn't use the Ruby DVI. It uses its own Frankenstein monster of database connections. And for PostgreSQL, it calls the pgcon quote method, which is defined in the Postgres database adapter, which uses PQ escape string, which is defined by PQ lib, or libpq. So what this means for me that I found is that if I try to do call a method here where I said find by email and I'm passing in a value with a backslash, I get, hey, don't do that. Right? This drove us nuts for quite a while in our testing, so I finally got fed up. Although I will say, please help. Will somebody please adopt the core unlocked Ruby Postgres driver, which hasn't been updated in 5, 6, or 7 years?
I know somebody in here who's done some stuff.
I sort of started on it, but I started a little fork on Ruby Forge, but I wasn't really ready to dedicate a lot of time to it.
Yeah.
So I do have, actually when I started it, I didn't realize the Ruby Forge automatically publishes kind of an announcement that you started a project. Which I was going to do this kind of covertly until I was actually ready to do a release. But then people started sending me other patches that weren't accepted by the previous maintainer that...
I think I saw that thread,
yeah,
actually.
Yeah, he had been kind of out of... I think I might have talked with you over email about.
Probably.
You might have been one of the people I was communicating with.
Probably.
Then eventually, yeah, when people start seeing it, then they start sending me patches and saying, yeah, the other guy couldn't get a hold of them, but here's a patch.
Yeah.
And some of the patches were good.
Yeah, yeah.
And some of the stuff in Ruby Postgres is broken.
Yeah.
And just, you know, if nothing else, there is no access. The PQ escape string is, I don't know if it's deprecated or not, but that's not really a recommended thing to use. And they don't provide any mechanism to use the correct quoting methods. So
yeah, I tried to patch it myself and it didn't work. I'm not a licensed programmer.
So it's certainly worth really trying to get that in a better state. So I think it's in somewhat of a better state, but I haven't had time to do a release.
A release would be really valuable. And you're right, there are a couple of them, but the other one is the pure Ruby one.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's okay if you don't want to run anything in production.
Right. I think there's like 3 of them, right? And it's impossible to figure out which one you're supposed to use and where it's sticking.
I use the one that's just called Postgres.
Yeah.
And of course, I have a build set up for it because I have to patch it to compile Mac OS 10. But anyway. But
Long story short, it's in the works.
Yeah, right. I'll see that by Christmas, right? In the meantime, let's monkey patch this bad boy. So again, I'm also, patching the PostgreSQL adapter class, and this is an ugly, ugly, ugly app, right? I'm aliasing the original quote method, which is what it uses for quoting strings, redefining the quote method, and hey, if it has a backslash in it, stick an E in front of it. Warnings are gone. So check it out. Warnings? What warnings?
David, you know you can turn that warning off, don't you?
I wasn't there.
The GUC setting in Postgres, and you can turn that warning off.
I couldn't figure it out.
It's down to backwards compatibility options, and it's called escape strings. And you can just set it to accept all.
Okay. Well, I'll do that, and I'll take out that name tag.
The reason that we put it there in the first place is that it's a SQL injection exploit.
Yeah. So take your poison.
Yeah, it's going, it's going to go away and it's going to, warning comes here.
No, I know. But so please somebody update the driver.
Your implementation is good for community values.
But that's all beside the point. The point is, hey, you can reopen the Rails classes and you can fuck them up. So did you guys happen to notice this method I called in that last example, find by email? This is some of the sugar that Rails provides, where you can automatically call a method find by whatever attribute you want, or find by whatever attribute you want, and some other attribute you want. And then, or you can find all by attribute, because these by default just return one object. And you just pass the appropriate arguments. Yep. I'll finish up this section. So, but sometimes you need different data, and maybe it's structured tables, or you have aggregate function results, or you do some other kinds of calculations, and you want to get it back kind of as a record set, not, as this class. For this way of doing things, you use find by SQL. For example, let's say I want to have user objects where there's a widget count for each one. So I call user find by SQL, and I pass it the string for the SQL to execute. And here I'm doing the usual stuff for user objects, but then I'm doing a count of the widget objects by doing a join and all that. And so then I magically get this widget count method because that is the name I used in the query. So again, it shows you how Rails pulls stuff in from the query itself and automatically gives you these magic methods. If you want to pass array parameters using placeholders, you pass an array defined by SQL, starting here. You pass the first argument, just like the conditions I showed you earlier, is the SQL statement. There was the where clause, here it's just the SQL statement. And then you pass in your placeholder, and then any values that you get assigned to that as part of the array. So, what does this do? Let's skip my tale of woe. I had a tale of woe in 3 parts. Let's see here. Now that ends. Somebody's handing you duck. Here, the problem I was trying to solve, just to summarize, is that I have, and Sandy, you can have repeatable events, which is single events, and so what it does is a join to another table has all possible dates for a certain repetition. So I can say the Postgres is an annual conference as a single object, but I want to get, if I'm now putting, like a list, I want to get a whole bunch of them for, 5 years out or something for repetition. So Rails identifies objects by the ID column. If you join in another table, you're going to get multiple rows of the same ID column. It'll mash them all up into a single object. So I had this hideous thing where I did some more archaeology in the Rails. I called class eval on the join base, and I basically overrode how it identifies individual objects by saying, hey, if it's events, no, don't just return ID, but return this row starts at alias, which is starts at, and ID. So then this says to Rails, hey, you identify an object by these two columns instead of just the ID column. But I have to do this within the scope of my find recurring method. Within there, when it's done, I call in the ensure block, which is something you can put at the end of any Ruby method and ensure that this code will run even if there's an exception within the rest of the method. I restore the original ID method. And then within that scope, this query can run on the correct view that I created.
And this gets rid of all of your math?
What?
Gets rid of all your methamphetamine.
Does it? Is it math?
It gets rid of the meth row, folks.
Yeah, that's a little organ for you.
I think it was Rails ID, I think is what I was going for. No, it's record ID. So yeah, it gets rid of your math. So then,
All messed up.
the nice thing was that I could say find recurring where I'm including the user object and it returns 5 objects even though it's just one object repeated 5 times. Anyway, so, okay, yes. So, just to summarize, the Rails way is, from a database point of view, which is why I suppose we're all here, the easy things are really easy to do in Rails. It provides a lot of sugar, saccharin, some might say. But the hard things are a real pain in the ass.
So to quote the Larry, it would be making easy things automatic and hard things impossible.
Yes. I like that better than what I came up with. It is possible to do things, but you've got to be, with persistence. And if you're not afraid to be evil and you don't mind replacing undocumented private methods with Rails. So, who should use Rails? Are you a Rails hacker? Yeah. A Ruby hacker? Then yeah, use Rails. It makes sense. Are you a Perl hacker? No, not so much. Are you a Python hacker? No, not so much. Are you a PHP hacker? Sorry. More resources, rubylanguage.org. Ruby is a really lovely language, by the way. This has specific instructions for Postgres-related stuff for Rails, which most of the name is how to install the driver. And then you can read about the full API there. Thank you.
A couple things to note. Catalyst actually supports multi-column primary keys, so you don't have to hack undocumented primary keys. But of course,
and Abstract does take patches.
Before Robert starts here, something I would like to talk about today. How many of you have written a PL/PGSQL function? How many of you have had to deal with quoting PL/PGSQL function? How many of you remember, or how many of you enjoyed dollar quoting?
Yeah.
Everyone? Yes. You can thank that man right there below the projector for dollar quoting.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, next talk. Oh my God, what is this?